all sorts of people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
For everyone joining us today, thanks so much for being online. We're going to be starting in a minute. We're having this talk about how we pulled together this fireworks story that published just last week. Generated a lot of interest. Of course, this has been something we've been tracking since the tragedy that happened just after New Year's Eve, January 1st of this year, the big explosion in Salt Lake and Leomanu. That's what kind of launched us on this whole journey, and so we'll be getting right into that in a couple of minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Blaze Lovell, and I'm joined here by Investigations editor John Hill for this talk story on a recent fireworks story that published just last week. We're streaming this live on YouTube and on other platforms, and we're taking audience questions throughout today's event. It'll be on for about an hour. We're stopping at around 1 p.m. Just a little bit about John. He's been with Civil Beat since 2016. He's from Pittsburgh. His reporting career has taken him from Northern California to New York City to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and back to Northern California, and of course here to Hawaii. And I'm sure I missed a couple stops along the way. It's been a winding path, a lot like this story that we're here to talk about today. Now, a little bit of background on this case that we'll be discussing. There was an illegal shipment of fireworks that was discovered in a container at the Sand Island facility back in 2022. This, in looking into this, it sort of took us from here to Chicago to Indiana, a lot of stops along the way. And by the end, we get back here to Hawaii at the end of that story. I want to say at the top that there's still a lot we don't know about this case. For example, we don't know exactly who the intended recipient of this shipment was. We don't know if the parties that we talk about in the story have done this sort of thing in the past. We don't know if they've sold illegal fireworks here in the past. So if there's questions out there about that, those are things we don't know yet. But we can tell you what we do know. And so, John, you've been looking into this fireworks issue for a couple of years now. You had a story that ran in 2023 that looked at a lot of the citation data. Sort of remind us what happened there, and try to bring it back to how we got started, how that led to this Coast Guard case with the container.
Sure. Yeah, I did a couple of stories in 2023. One of them was about, I just looked at citations issued by the Honolulu Police Department to people who were shooting off illegal fireworks, and found that almost all of them, I forget the exact percentage, but it was something like 95% of them never got prosecuted. They just were dismissed. And so it was sort of raised the question of why even bother going through this whole charade of issuing citations if it's not going to lead anywhere. And then more germane to this story was a second story that I did about the different state and federal agencies that are responsible for sort of policing illegal fireworks, and how they come in through the port, and how there's really no clear lead, or there was no clear lead at that time. It's sort of gotten a little more clarified since then, but there was no clear lead about who was going to, look into containers to see if they had illicit fireworks. And it's kind of, the different agencies had to have sort of reasons to, they can't just willy-nilly open up containers. They have different jurisdictions, they have different laws and regulations about when the kind of suspicions they have to be able to open up a container. And that's kind of what that story was about. Now, in the course of doing that story, one of the things that I mentioned was this 2022 shipment that the Coast Guard interdicted at Honolulu Harbor. And they told me a little bit about it, and not a lot, though. And I, in the meantime, made a FOIA request to the Coast Guard for their report about this incident. And I didn't get that report until a few months after the story ran. And I remember it came in, and I kind of said, "Oh, that finally came through." And I took a quick look through it, and just discard. I mean, I just put it on the back burner. And after the Salt Lake tragedy this year, we decided that it would be worth using that incident to go back and use it as a case study of how illicit fireworks get in here. And that's kind of what we did. That's how we decided to sort of look more closely at that incident.
That day on New Year's Day, you were still technically on vacation, actually, right on the mainland.
I was.
I'm starting to remember how this all unfolded, and so we had this big meeting to figure out how we're going to tackle this issue. And you brought up the Coast Guard report.
Right.
You sent it to us, and then that's where I had started to look
Yeah.
into stuff while you were making your way back to California. And I sort of remember, and you said this too. You spent a lot of days like banging your head on the wall, wondering, what are we gonna get out of this? And there's like, um, sort of the most useful piece of paper in that report was the bill of lading. That's like the receipt for when you have to go pay your shipment. And there was initially we actually couldn't see all the information on it because it was like missing letters
Yeah.
and numbers and stuff. But we could sort of make out this one address in the upper left hand corner on the bill of lading that was, you could make out the word Berkeley. You couldn't really totally tell the address or the street name or even the zip code, but there was Berkeley. And so I remember initially we thought, well, maybe the shipment said it went from Chicago to Oakland and then to Hawaii. So maybe this is Berkeley, California. And I remember figuring out that it's Berkeley, Illinois, based on the zip code, and narrowed down the address to like the 5300 block of the St. Charles Road that we talk about in the story. And then that's what led us to this sort of almost out of place looking building on St. Charles Road. It had like this brick facade. It's like it's this chimney cleaning business. That address eventually led us to this the figure in the story named Nicholas Foligno. It turned out that he had also used that address that's on the shipment bill. Um, it was the it was the office address for this company called Fuse Fireworks in Indiana.
Yeah.
So that was like one thing that stood out to us, I think. There's this address that's connected to a different fireworks business. And when you Google the name Nick Foligno or Nicholas Foligno, one of the first hits you'd get on Google was this like story out of Maui that quoted this fireworks store employee in Kihei who also happened to be named Nick Foligno. And you eventually get to that. You eventually get to that who are all the people behind these chain of fireworks businesses here in Hawaii called Paradise Fireworks. But yeah, so I spent a couple of days on that. You get back to Hawaii, and we have you have a few things to track down. The bill of lading mentions this company called Liberty Fasteners.
Mm-hmm.
That's the
Mm-hmm.
company that's on the bill that has this St. Charles Road address. But when you started looking into it, um, there's some discrepancies with the real Liberty Fasteners. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. Yeah. There were. I mean, there is an actual company called Liberty Fastener, but the problem is that Liberty Fastener is 9 miles north of this St. Charles Road address. And when I got in touch with this CEO of Liberty Fastener, I could tell she didn't really want to talk or engage in this in any way. She just sort of didn't want to have anything to do with it. But eventually she told me, no, we had nothing to do with this. We don't have anything to do with fireworks. She didn't even know that the name of Liberty Fastener had been used on this illegal shipment. So it was all a surprise to her. And so, yeah. But you did, Blaze. I remember the initial memo that you wrote about what you had found in the first couple of days, and there was this thing about Nick Foligno which was the name that was associated with Fuse Fireworks, this company in Indiana, where he listed his address as this place in Berkeley, Illinois, 5317 St. Charles. And then we find this Nick Foligno who's selling fireworks in Hawaii, and both of us thinking, this just can't be a coincidence. I remember I had a source one time um, when I was working in California. I had a really good source in the California Highway Patrol, and he always used to tell me he didn't believe in, he called them coinky dinks. Like when you come across something like that, it just, you know, I mean, it could be a coincidence, but chances are it's not.
Yeah, and this fireworks store in Winnemac, it's
Yeah.
Winnemac, Indiana. It's like it's like a kitty corner lot. I mean, it almost looks like a sort of like a convenience store, but it's this little store, and you could go in, and they're selling fireworks. And one of the I remember looking at photos of their products, and one of their products was this fountain called Waikiki Light, which
Yeah.
also ends up being one of the products sold in this in one of these Paradise Fireworks locations. That company also gave us some trouble, because I remember trying to figure out who exactly is we can use the state's business registry to look up company names, and then you can see the ownership and who the officers or entities are behind these companies, and the name and variations of it just wouldn't pop up in our state registry, our state business registry. How did you eventually figure out the actual name of this place as it is in the like on state paperwork?
Oh, Pacific
Yeah.
Fireworks? Yeah, well, I mean, I think I got to a point with the Nick Foligno conundrum, and just being frustrated that we knew that this guy was selling fireworks in Kihei, and we also knew that somebody of that name was associated with the dress in Illinois. And I, I actually don't remember exactly how it happened, but I discovered that there was a third person associated with that address by the name of John Massari. And it also happened to be the case that John Massari, and this goes back to the corporate filings for Pacific Fireworks in Hawaii, he was the one who, for the last 10 years or so, has been getting these permits to sell fireworks at the retail locations at, in Hawaii. There's like 5 of them now. And so I mean, I think the eureka moment for this came when I realized that there was an association between that address in Illinois, in Berkeley, Illinois, and Nick Foligno and John Massari. Because again, John Massari is not a common name either, and so there were certain business documents, like in Illinois, to contain, like there was one in particular. There was a mortgage that John Massari had given to Nick Foligno. I think it was a refinance of a mortgage for that address, 5317 St. Charles. So now we have three data points. We have the address, and we have this one person, Nick Foligno, and we have John Massari, who is, his company Star Fireworks is in North Dakota, and they're the ones who legally import hundreds of tons of fireworks to Hawaii over the past, 10 years or so.
How long did it get for you to? How long did it take for you to get to that eureka moment? Obviously, we're kind of truncating how this all played out for the purposes of this conversation, but that wasn't like an easy feat, or
No, it was weeks. I
yeah,
mean, it really was weeks. And when you put it all together after the fact, it kind of looks obvious. But when you're, as you know, when you're kind of in it and you're just trying to figure out, now, how does this person connect to that person? It's not at all clear. And so it took weeks to kind of put that all together.
yeah. I probably could have saved you weeks of headache, because when I look back through my notes, John Massari and that NJ Properties company was on a list of people and entities connected to Nicholas Foligno,
Yeah.
but it was like it was just I kind of just like looked past it, because there was dozens of people that were connected to that name and that address, and it at the, like you said, at the time it didn't seem, the connections didn't seem obvious. Looking back, obviously now they were, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it too is that the name John Massari, I mean, was not one that was necessarily we were looking for, you know, and we didn't know who he was. But then once his name did pop up and it was like, wait, who's this guy? You found out it was very easy to find out that he was heavily involved in fireworks. He has this fireworks company in North Dakota. He has a podcast about fireworks in which they talked. I found this one of the episodes of their podcast. They talked about this other person that we're, I think, going to talk about, Larry Lomaz, and I found a clip from the Chicago Tribune in the 1990s when John Massari was in his 20s, where he was driving a van full of fireworks, and somehow they caught fire and they all exploded as he was driving this van. And so this guy has been involved in fireworks his entire life. Um, he's been quoted in interviews talking about how when he was a kid, he was just fascinated with fireworks, and he'd buy fireworks for a party, and then his friends would say, "Hey, can you get me some fireworks?" And he would buy them fireworks, and that led to him becoming sort of a fireworks entrepreneur. And so once we discovered that, then this whole world opened up of the last 25 years of fireworks retail sales in Hawaii.
Yeah. We'll get to Larry Lomaz in a second, but I did want to get to one of the audience questions. And I'll preface this by saying, like, we've been talking a lot about our findings. This person wants to know how we, found them. And I found, like, journalists tend to do this. We like to talk about what we've discovered, but we don't always go through the process of how that happens. You see that a lot at, like, if you go to journalism conferences, the war stories. You've been an investigative reporter for a long time. Just quickly go over, like, the kinds of sourcing and documents that
Yeah.
we use in a case like this.
I mean, the first thing, I mean, honestly, it's kind of embarrassing to admit, but the first thing you do is just Google names and addresses, right? Like anyone could do. But then we also have access to a service called TLO that is a combination of property records, business associations, personal associations, addresses, mortgages, all sorts of stuff like that. But then those aren't, TLO doesn't really give you the primary documents. So then we go to the different states and we look at their business records. Business records are very public, and you can usually get them quite easily for free in most states, and they're very detailed and easy to get. Property records are another huge thing because so much of this centered on this one property in Illinois. Looking very closly at the property records there and who was associated with that property was a big part of it. Looking at stuff on Google Street View and seeing what stuff looks like. Oh, well, there's not a fastener company there. What is there? Oh, they've got a little sign in the window of this place saying they're a chimney business, a chimney cleaning business, and just doing stuff like that. So it's a combination of all those things. I mean, the best. And then, of course, there were the original, the Coast Guard investigative report was what launched us on all this, even though it was very incomplete. It did have clues in it. And then there's social media, the Facebook pages of these different fireworks companies. So all those things together.
In general, not necessarily just in this case, but when you're approaching stories, there's, like, I feel like there's a smorgasbord of public records and different things that we always want to go out and get: lawsuits, business records, corporate filings, SEC data, FEC data, all the acronyms for all the things. What do you prioritize first when you're starting on a new story?
I mean, I think I'd go first to TLO, just because TLO, which we pay for, it pulls together a lot of different stuff, and it's not definitive. You have to go get the original documents, but it just gives you kind of an initial snapshot of the kinds of documents that might pay off. I should mention too, Blaze, I'm glad you mentioned court documents, because one of the really key documents in this investigation was a federal judge report that was done in 2005. And we can get into, when we talk about Larry Lomaz, what that said. But that turned out to be, so federal court looking through Pacer, looking through state court. Like it was like looking through e-court Kokua
Mhm.
was key because, for one thing, when I found out who the owners of Star Fireworks in North Dakota were, it was John Massari and it was somebody else named Dino Alexakos. And I just ran his name in e-court Kokua, and there was a citation for him selling firecrackers to an undercover cop without a license. So that was, I mean, that ended up being just a paragraph in the story, but court records are definitely key.
Yeah. So, I guess now that people know how we're looking at this, how do we get to Larry Lomaz?
So Larry Lomaz, um, and I should have kept a journal through this whole thing because I don't remember every little step. But once
Yeah.
I started looking into John Massari, it became clear that he was associated with this character named Larry Lomaz, who was really a notorious fireworks outlaw. And I say that advisedly, he died in 2012, and supposedly you can't libel people who have died, but I say that advisedly. It's not just my opinion. I mean, there were federal regulators that found that he repeated, not just federal regulators, but also state regulators that found that he repeatedly violated fireworks safety laws and put consumers and the public at risk. Throughout his career, he was kind of a fireworks outlaw. And then it became apparent that up until his death in 2012, he was the one who owned these Pacific Fireworks outlets that later were taken over by John Massari. And so that opened up this whole just avenue of research into who was this guy. And when people are asking about our sources, we do have an account with Nexus, so we can, and also newspapers.com. So we can look up old stories. And there were a lot of stories about Larry Lomaz because there were papers in New Hampshire and Ohio and Illinois that wrote about his exploits violating fireworks laws over the years.
Mhm. And Larry Lomaz, he also got involved, not politically. He didn't run for office and wasn't trying to become a politician, but I mean, he lobbied for and against certain fireworks measures here, correct?
He did. I mean, he ended up having a big presence in Hawaii. I don't really know the backstory of how he started coming here or how he opened up these stores. I didn't really find that. But once he was here, and by the end of his life, one of the stories I found about him said that quoted him as saying he was spending most of his time in Hawaii. So Hawaii became a big, important market for him, and he sort of pushed the envelope here. In 2010, he introduced this product, or he was one of the people selling it. I think he was one of the primary people selling these things called sky lanterns. They were sort of like these little hot air balloons. And the fire departments in all the different islands kind of went nuts about this because there was no way to control where these things went. They could land anywhere and catch things on fire, and we know what fire can do in Hawaii. Um, and they actually confiscated 1,200 of these sky lanterns from Larry Lomaz and paid him for them. And then they went to the legislature and said, "You have to ban these things; they're too dangerous." And a couple years later, the legislature passed a law saying no more sky lanterns in Hawaii; they're just too dangerous. They had been banned in places like England and Germany because they started fires. But Larry Lomaz was also an advocate, and this was kind of ironic. When Honolulu was considering, and at one point, Honolulu was considering a total ban on all fireworks, including firecrackers. And we know that they ultimately stopped short of that and they still allow firecrackers. But when that was happening, Larry Lomaz was very vocal against that proposal. And what he said was kind of ironic, which was that you'll just drive everything to the black market and you'll drive up and people will spend, 10 times the the normal price for black market fireworks. And whether or not he was involved in selling those black market fireworks is a question. We know that he imported fireworks to Hawaii against a consent agreement he had with the feds. Because he had violated all these fireworks laws, the feds said to him, the Consumer Protection Agency, I forget the full name of that agency, but they said, if you're importing any fireworks to the US, you must tell us first. But then he started using straw men to import fireworks without telling the feds. And it turned out that one of these straw man shipments was done through John Massari, who later took over the retail stores here. And another straw person in these transactions was someone we haven't mentioned yet, which is Erica Kleinfeld. And she actually has for a long time run the Pacific Fireworks store in Hui. So it all kind of comes together that way. But Larry Lomaz, you're right. He was very active in trying to keep fireworks, aerial fireworks, legal in Hawaii, and he sort of pushed the envelope with these sky lanterns. And I think he was the person behind Waikiki Lights, which is actually a legal form of fireworks on most of the islands, not on Oahu, but on Maui and
Kauai.
on Kauai. They can say, because it's a fountain, it's not an aerial. And so, but I think that as Nick Foligno said in an interview at one point, they made fireworks with brand names that were specifically to be sold in Hawaii. Although I think they ended up being sold all over the U.S. You can find Waikiki Lights in fireworks stores in the Midwest,
like Winamac, Indiana.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
That interview. Just to go back to this question on sourcing, that was like a radio thing you found, right?
Yeah, yeah. There was a radio station on Maui where the host is really into fireworks, and he had a phone interview with Nick Foligno about what they were offering at their store in Kihei, and then he posed afterwards with Nick, which was kind of key for us because we could then see it was the same Nick Foligno who had been mentioned in other places. So that's how we heard about the Waikiki Lights.
Yeah. And speaking of the radio, because HPR played a Chubby Checkers song the other day, there's this kind of weird incident with a property that Chubby Checkers owned
Yeah.
that involved Larry Lomaz.
Yeah. Well, this thing goes back to there was last fall, there was a fireworks convention in Erie, Pennsylvania. I guess we go to reporters conventions every year. There's a convention for fireworks merchants. And Larry Lomaz, John Massari was there, as you would expect, because he's, in the fireworks business. And he did one of his podcast episodes from the convention, and they talked about Larry Lomaz, and it was John Massari and three other people in the fireworks business. And they were just sort of exchanging war stories about the legendary Larry Lomaz. And one of them was, they talked about all the people he ripped off and stiffed. And one of them was Chubby Checkers. I don't know. They didn't go into detail about what happened with Chubby Checker, but they just said, oh, yeah, remember when he ripped off Chubby Checker? So, there were stories about him being in some swanky hotel in Baltimore and throwing firecrackers into the bathtub until they got, there were just all these, war stories about Larry Lomaz and what a renegade he was.
Yeah. Back to this container that the Coast Guard found on Staten Island. It had 13,000 pounds of fireworks in it. How much? What was the dollar value of all that was in the container?
More than 2 million, north of 2 million. And I wonder, one thing that I might have done a little bit more reporting on is how much these illicit fireworks sell for, because people spend a lot of money in Honolulu for illicit fireworks. So is the 2.7 million, I think it was, that shipment was worth, was that the face value of those aerial fireworks, like what you would pay if you paid in Indiana? Or was it what the black market value would be on Oahu? Because if it was the first, I would think that the black market value would be a lot higher than that. I don't know how they calculated that.
Yeah. Like you were saying earlier, and like you put in the story, a lot of these connections that we found and sources that we use, anybody with an internet connection could do this. You could I mean, we Googled a lot of these things
Yeah.
that eventually led to, the primary documents. What did, federal investigators who have much more resources than we do, have to say about all this when you contacted them?
I mean, it was really confusing because, back in 2023, when I did those initial stories that you referenced, I asked the Coast Guard, about what had happened, and the Coast Guard representative told me, "Oh, yeah, we figured out who the fireworks were going to, and it was somebody who didn't have a permit to receive these kinds of fireworks." And, I thought, "Well, that's interesting." And then when I got the report a few months later through the Freedom of Information Act, there was no reference in the report to who the intended recipient had been, which maybe makes sense because it wasn't really the Coast Guard's business to do the to enforce the fireworks part of it. They're more concerned about the safety of the port and people shipping things without declaring what they are, and sort of making sure that everything at the port is safe and nobody's going to blow up the port, right? But then all the other agencies who might have had a hand or did have a hand in this at least knew about it. None of them had a single report about this. I'm talking about ATF, the State Department of Law Enforcement. Or I guess it was the sheriffs at that point who are now
Mhm.
under DLE, but at the time were not. They were witnesses. They were at the dock when they repackaged these fireworks and sent them back to the mainland. And, none of these agencies had anything to tell me about. They didn't know anything. What they told me was they didn't know anything about it. They had no reports about it, nothing. So, I don't know what happened. I mean, it's possible that the FBI looked into it, but of course the FBI would never share with us, an investigation that never led to charges. Like, the FBI doesn't confide in us about stuff like that,
Mhm.
and never have really. So it's possible that they went somewhere with it, but I saw no evidence that anybody went anywhere with it.
Yeah. This is another question, I guess, on journalism craft. At what point do you, um, tell these government agencies specifically, like what we have, what we're going to publish, and ask for their response?
I mean, with government agencies, I don't sweat it too much because you could ask unless you're accusing them of actual wrongdoing, you can always come back to them. And in this case, we're not so much accusing them of wrongdoing. We're sort of asking, like, we're asking them to be accountable for their actions in this case. And we don't really know the answer. We don't know exactly what they did. But when it comes to the who I would say were the targets of the
Mhm.
investigation,
The people.
yeah, the people that all the names that we've mentioned, we I mean, there's different schools of thought about this among journalists, as you know. But since the story had to go through the whole editing process, and editors may have more questions you didn't think of, we generally like to wait till towards the end. Now, of course, you want to give people enough time to respond. You don't want to jam them at the last minute. We're publishing a story tomorrow, and we need your answer in the next, 2 hours. I did wait until after the story was edited, so I because you might only get one shot, right,
Yeah.
to interview these folks, and you want to cover everything you're going to need to cover. So, in this particular case, it made sense to wait till towards the end, but of course, we gave them weeks and weeks to
Mhm.
respond.
How do you contact them, and what the different avenues do you go through? A lot of these people aren't in Hawaii. It's not something that we can just pick up a phone book and ring them. Talk about that process a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because TLO, as you know, Blaze, I'm sure you've experienced this too. Oftentimes, the phone numbers of the service that we use, that we pay for,
Mhm.
the phone numbers aren't correct. So you have to go through other methods. One interesting method in this case was all these people had applied for permits to run these retail stores and also to import fireworks into Hawaii. And when I asked for the permits, and that's something I didn't mention too, when you were asking about documents, I got the different counties to give me the permits, that these parties, put in to be able to run these retail stores and to import fireworks into Hawaii, and they listed phone numbers, and these were good phone numbers because they were recent, and they were what the people themselves were saying,
Mhm.
"This is my phone number," and, when you called the numbers, I mean, it was a different story for each person, but it was pretty clear for a couple of them that it was the right number because you hear a voicemail, you hear the person's name saying, "This is so and so, please leave a message." So you know it's the right number. But just in an abundance of caution, we also send what we call no surprise letters, like telling the targets of the investigation, we are about to publish something. This is what the story says. No surprises. If you think, if you want to debate any of this or add to any of this or contradict any of it, now's the time to do it because this is what we're publishing. And we did that in this case.
Mhm. After the story ran, was there any reaction from any of the government agencies?
No, in fact, there was no reaction. There was a lot of reaction from readers, but there was crickets from the agencies and also the people that we wrote about. Not a thing, not a
Yeah.
word.
How does that stack up against other stories you've done in Hawaii? I'm thinking about in Hawaii in particular.
In Hawaii, it's I have found, I've been a reporter here now for almost 10 years, and I have found that for whatever reasons, stories that if I had done them in other states, there would have been some legislator or some public official on the phone the next day saying, "I'm introducing a bill about this," or I'm demanding answers on this, or we're going to have a hearing about this. Um, do not elicit that kind of response here.
Mhm.
And we could probably have another hour-long show about why that is.
Yeah.
I don't know. What's your experience? Tell me.
I mean, when you said no surprises letters, I had kind of a PTSD moment from when I was working for the New York Times about a year ago, and we were getting ready to wrap up the investigation on campaign donations from contractors because I had to send a lot of those letters out before that story ran. But we had and there was even in the Times every morning they have their morning meeting where they set out here's the stories that are going to lead the day and here's why and here's potential follow-ups for each of them, and that story was listed for that Wednesday. And there was a note to pay attention to the legislature, the county councils, the ethics commission for a potential reaction, which would give us another story to run. And so I story runs. I do TV in the morning. I get back home and I'm watching the legislature, and there's like you said, in any other place, someone would get up to speechify about what just happened, and there was exactly crickets. There was of course reaction from the ethics commission, but that's based on the people on there and the director and their jobs under the law, that's expected for them to react. And they jumped on it and have regular updates around different avenues and angles that story is sort of exposed. And so they've been on top of it, but the major agencies, exact same reaction. Not a lot.
I remember the day that this ran. You were at the legislature and you came back, and I said, but you knew I was joking. I said, "Wow, I bet you everybody's buzzing about this down there,"
Yeah,
and there was
yeah.
nobody
There
talking about it.
wasn't nothing again
No,
at the in the legislature.
yeah.
I wanted to move to some audience questions now. We've been talking about some of them as we've gone along. Um, okay, here's one. I think I actually know the answer to this, but I can't remember, so I'm going to ask you instead. Regarding the importation of illegal fireworks, what is the line between fireworks and explosives? I know there's like this container code that we've used in the past. Is
Mhm.
that all? Well, I guess the question is there a difference between
I
fireworks
mean,
and
fireworks are considered
explosives?
explosives, and I mean, I don't know all the ins and outs of this, but there's different grades. There's like 1.4 G,
G.
which is what like aerial fireworks, like we see here on New Year's Eve, are 1.4 G, and then 1.3 G are display fireworks, and then 1.2 and 1.1 that goes beyond fireworks. I think those are things that are like could blow up an entire container ship.
Hmm.
But of course they they're supposed to have these labels. If you're shipping fireworks, they have this triangle, this yellow triangle that says like 1.4G or 1.3G. They're also supposed to have something called an EX number, which is I guess X stands for export or something. It's a number you get to show that you are legally exporting fireworks that have been approved as safe. And actually, on this shipment, I couldn't see every single box in the photographs that were in the Coast Guard report, but some of them at least had those symbols on them. So these were fireworks that were legal elsewhere in the United States.
Hmm.
They just were not legal in Hawaii.
Yeah. What does the 1.4 and 3 stand for? Do you remember?
I think it's, I don't even know. I grams of uh, explosive material, and I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I couldn't figure it out.
It's beyond my pay grade.
There was a lot. Just back to this Coast Guard report. There was um like a lot of different symbols and stuff, and we're not like logistics experts. Did you have to reach any to kind of explain like how these containers move around the U.S. and what all this means?
I did. I actually had a couple of people who didn't want to be on the record, who were really useful at explaining how things work with the fireworks industry, and how they're all supposed to have these stickers on them that say they've been cleared by this organization that verifies that fireworks are safe. And interestingly, Larry Lomaz, one of his shipments to Hawaii back in the early 2000s, only one of 500, I think, containers, boxes had this safety sticker, but they're all supposed to have that safety sticker. So yeah, there are people. There's always people who, they don't always want to go on the record, but they want to help, and they like talking about, like, I mean, one thing we've learned as reporters over the years is if you can get someone talking about something they know a lot about and hardly anyone ever asks them about, that's like pure gold.
Yeah, yeah. And to that bill of lading, I remember, using Google again to figure out what shipper and, consignee meant, and this
Yeah.
thing to figure out sort of how this container took its path from Chicago to Hawaii.
I would say too, the
Oh,
U.S. Department of Transportation had a really useful, like, little pamphlet almost showing, like, about shipping fireworks, trucking, what you have to do if you have fireworks in a truck and stuff like that. And it was all pretty interesting, pretty germane to this.
yeah. And since we're talking about the trucking, there's a lot of these places that we looked at in Chicago. They're all sort of kind of close together. There was this other warehouse that was in the bill that I wasn't sure if it we don't know if it actually had anything to do, but a lot of the locations were sort of like within miles of each other.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I've always loved maps myself, and it was interesting to just put this stuff all on a map and see, oh, okay, well, this place that may have actually given the container to Matson is just like, as the crow flies, a quarter mile from 5317 St. Charles Road, just across the train depot. Oh, and this Liberty Fastener place is like right next to O'Hare Airport and 9 miles away from these other places, and like that.
Yeah. And speaking of maps, I remember joking that you'd have to get out like a pin board and start tying strings to it, like that, the meme from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
Yeah,
How did you? And in fact, I think your map is still up in one of the conference rooms.
it is.
It's not a pin board. We have a whiteboard, but same concept. How did you like lay all this out in a way it makes sense to yourself?
I mean, that was one way to do it. Is like, in fact, I have something in my pocket, just like this little cheat sheet showing, like, oh, how all these people connect with each other, and just reminding myself for this, because it did get really complicated, and it was kind of like a little mind bending.
Yeah. I know you touched on this a little bit, but were there any law enforcement agencies that reached out on the story at all, on anything to do with the story?
No, and I didn't really force it, and I still could. I mean, I could just start calling different agencies and asking if they have a response. I haven't done that yet, but we can still do that. One thing I really wonder about is every year these Pacific fireworks places, they go and get permits to run these retail stores, and it's these same cast of characters. And I wonder next December if they are going to issue them permits, and that's
Mm.
something we're obviously going to follow.
Yeah. This other question, I think, actually has to do with those specific fireworks stores. They want to know if any of those retail stores are under investigation.
I mean, not that we know of, but again, that's something that certainly worthy of following up on.
Mhm. We got a couple of questions before this event started. Some of them had to do with HPD, and specifically, they were addressing this, I guess, belief that's out there that some or a lot of the people that are popping fireworks or buying fireworks are cops, basically. In this story or in your past reporting on fireworks, did you find any evidence that would substantiate that?
That's really interesting. I mean, I've heard the same thing.
Yeah.
I've never been able to prove that. Now, when I did that story in 2023 about how HBD, they actually issue these citations, um, and they never lead to actual fines or anything like that. They just get dropped. They did all the citations listed the professions of the person who was getting the citation, um, and I actually included in the story the range of professions that people were who were
Yeah.
shooting off fireworks, and none of them were police officers. But maybe it's not surprising since it was HPD, it was issuing the citations.
Mhm.
Um, but I've seen solid evidence of that, but I've heard it enough that it makes me wonder.
Yeah. Right now the legislature is talking about some bills that would apparently change definitions in the law that would make it easier to prosecute some fireworks cases. When you were looking at these citations data that you got through the court system, how many of those actually resulted in any charges?
I mean, so what would happen would HPD would issue the citation, and then the person would be called into court, or they would have a court date, and they oftentimes wouldn't show up, and then the court would just say, "Ah, let's drop it,"
Mm,
or the prosecuting attorney's office would say, "Yeah," and then we're dropping it. And it was like a tiny percentage, like 5%, that actually had to pay a fine, and it wasn't like they went to jail or anything. I mean, they paid a fine, and that
mhm,
was pretty much it. I mean, there's supposedly this complication, and maybe this is what the legislature is addressing, where you have to witness the person shooting off the aerial firework or whatever in order for it to stick. And all these citations that I found in 2023 and for several years prior to that, I think I looked at 5 years of citations. It was actually the cops that saw it. So there was no problem in terms of prosecution because the officer saw it. So the officer could have gone into court and said, "Yeah, I saw this person shoot off this firework." But I don't know why that has to be. It's like it seems like there's a lot of other crimes where you don't have to witness it. You can use circumstantial evidence, but for some reason that doesn't work with fireworks.
mm. Yeah, and I know one of the one of the things they've been coming in and telling the lawmakers is, well, some of these provisions and laws hard to prove because once the firework goes up, it explodes. We have nothing to test.
Right.
Yeah,
The
right.
evidence is
Yeah,
gone.
the evidence is gone once it blows up.
Yeah, it's true. I've heard that too.
Back to this story that just ran last week. You've got your map out to kind of help coordinate your brain. But I wanted to know, at what point do you think, okay, I'm going to start writing this thing? Because I know even before that, there were several times you thought, um, you didn't necessarily have all the connections yet, but you thought, okay, well, we'll just write up whatever we've got so far. Like,
Yeah.
how does that decision making process go? At what point do you decide, we've got a story here?
Well, I mean, I was banging my head against the wall with this, and at some point, I actually said, "You know what? I'm just going to write up what I have, and it's really not even going to focus on who did it because we didn't really discover that or who sent this. It's going to focus on um, Matson and what their process is and how this container that weighed something different than what it actually weighed got as far as it did. Of course, Matson's consultant was eventually the one who discovered it, but." and then I'm just going to write it up and move on to the next thing. But then it was that Nick Foligno thing. It was that coincidence. I just could not give that up. And I said, I'm just going to take one more run at that. And I started looking more closely at the business records and more closely at the property records. And then it was that eureka moment of like, oh yeah, this is all tied together. And it is the same Nick Foligno. And that, then it just became sort of, it changed the focus of the story, really.
Folks, we've been talking to John Hill, our investigations editor here at Civil Beat, who just published this amazing piece on fireworks. I'm Blaze Lovell. Be sure to you could visit www.civilbeat.org to read more about this story and others. We also have another event planned soon. It's on childhood food insecurity in Hawaii. That's happening actually tomorrow here at our headquarters in Kaimuki, 3650 Waialae Avenue. That's happening between 6 p.m. and 7. You can register today at www.civilbeat.org/events. Thanks for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.